I'm very excited that we're all here today, and I've got my handy-dandy notebook because I want to make sure we cover all of the topics. But good morning, everyone. Thank you, Eli, for that introduction and for welcoming everyone. I'm very excited for the first panel of the Real Solutions Summit, Political Talk, Then and Now. We're going to take a deep dive into how American public discourse has changed. And I can't think of a better way to start a summit like this off than to talk about how we talk to one another. But first, let me introduce our panelists. First to my left, Emily Chamlee-Wright, President and CEO of the Institute for Humane Studies, which partners with scholars working within the classical liberal tradition to advance higher education's core purpose, intellectual diversity and human progress. Emily has led IHS for nearly a decade and brings deep academic and institutional background to this work. Previously, she served as provost and dean at Washington College, and Emily was the Albert H. Neese Professor of Economics and associate dean at Beloit College as well, with a PhD in economics from George Mason, and the author of Liberal Leaning and the Art of Self-Governance, among other books. So thank you.
Liberal learning.
Today, what did I say? Leaning?
Leaning. Which is,
appropriate for this conversation. Yes, but we actually want to learn as well as lean, okay, or maybe learn instead of lean. And we are joined here on stage as well with Eli Lake, who is a columnist for the Free Press. So thank you so much, Eli, for being here. He is also the host of a terrific new history podcast called Breaking History. If you have not listened to it, I really encourage you to. It is fantastic, everything from sort of uncovering the JFK conspiracies to the Opium Wars. So if you like reading and learning about history, you are not going to want to miss Breaking History. Eli is also a contributing editor at Commentary Magazine, and before joining the Free Press, he was a correspondent, national security correspondent for the Daily Beast, Newsweek, and the New York Sun. So thank you for bringing your expertise here. I'm feeling like between the light and my weird positioning and my glasses, I'm like a little awkward here. So we're going to try to reposition. But so today we're here to talk about American public discourse. And I'm very cautious not to pretend that there was ever sort of a golden age of political civility. But I think all of us in this room can acknowledge that the rise of Trump in 2016 seemed to mark a distinct shift in the tone of American politics. We suddenly saw an increase in personal attacks, right? We talked about Crooked Hillary and Sleepy Joe, and now we have different channels to get to communicate to people. So we no longer needed to go through certain filters. We had Twitter. There was a lot more populist anti-elite messaging. Misinformation became a new word. In fact, R Street has an entire scholar devoted to the topic of misinformation. So it's certainly changed the conversation. And I think with this change, we've seen sort of an increase in the coarseness. Debate seems more performative. Consensus seems more elusive. And that's all about, really, I think, something that's weighing on many of us. But at the same time, we're here talking about the semi-quincentennial and thinking, is now really that different from previous times in American history? I have a favorite historian, Joanne Freeman, up at Yale, and she has a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, called Affairs of Honor. And she describes the early republic, the time of our founding, being marked by regional distrust, personal animosity, accusation, suspicion, implication, denouncement. I mean, kind of sounds like today, right? Pretty familiar. So, and as the country, progressed, we didn't really, we didn't change our behavior so much, right? We would think that maybe we would mature, but instead, actually, Americans seem to want their lawmakers to fight for them. Physical confrontations were sort of cheered. And so while I don't think any of us have witnessed a duel in Congress, and that's probably some progress, right? The political vitriol that we experience today is certainly not new. And so with all of that in mind, I want to open up our conversation with a big picture question that when it comes to political discourse today, how concerned should we be about the current tone of our political environment? And I think we'll start with Eli and then move to Emily and then open it up a little more.
Well, I think it depends on how you want to approach the question.
because sometimes I think you can go back to an era when there were 3 major networks, there were major newspapers, and these performed a kind of gatekeeper function. But for those of us who are maybe on the center-right, those were the wilderness years. Those were the years when important critiques of the welfare state were pretty much kept out of the mainstream discourse. There was a really legitimate argument that this was a kind of way of putting one's thumb on the scale in terms of the public discourse, and it was reflected in our national politics, at least. On the other hand, right now, when you have, I think, a very atomized landscape for media and atomized politics, you often have, a kind of almost self-ghettoization, if you will, for various political tribes. And that can lead to not just a coarseness in our discourse, but it can also lead to kind of, political leaders not being able to really assess the signal from the noise. Mm-hmm. So, listen, we will learn from the historians and possibly journalists over the coming years what led to Liberation Day, the sort of day of many tariffs. But at least in one respect, I think you could say that Donald Trump did not anticipate that there were a lot of Americans who didn't feel they voted for that. There were a lot of Americans who didn't appreciate what he was doing. There was a terrible job in some ways in terms of explaining, like, all right, well, this is what we're going to do. This is our economic path forward. Now, is one of those, I think one reason for that is the fact that you have these kind of competing echo chambers. And I could have by the way, I could just as easily have given you an example from the Biden year when he meets with Doris Kearns Goodwin and all these historians saying, you have a chance to be like FDR. He did not have any kind of mandate to do that, and then proceeded to approve the largest spending package in the history of the Republic. That was something that didn't have any kind of popular support. If maybe we had a media ecosystem, a political discourse that was kind of, less tribal, less atomized, then perhaps there would have been an opportunity in that, to rein back some of these decisions, which I think have been destructive, I would say, in both cases. So that's one thing, but it's a complicated question. The only other thing I would just say in terms of coarseness, I do think that in American history it goes in waves. So what you had for the first 6 presidencies was almost a near consensus after the really contentious Adams-Jefferson election of 1800. So you had a 24-year period where there was almost a mono-party, you could say. It was basically it was the part that Jefferson had vanquished, what was left of the Federalists, I suppose. And even John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, was pretty much a Jeffersonian Republican at the time. So that led to the rise of Andrew Jackson, which was a very similar kind of jolt to our system that we're feeling with the second Trump presidency. And there's a lot of parallels there. Jackson believed that he was cheated out of the 1824 election, and in 1828 he ran in part on the idea that that election was stolen, very similar to the Trump campaign in 2024. So I would just point out that these things kind of go in waves, but before everybody kind of, gets apocalyptic and worries about the end of everything, it's important to know that there were, 8 years of Jackson and 4 years of Martin Van Buren, and then the populists were out of power. And there was a correction. So the system survived, even though there were a lot of very serious tests. So it's maybe a long way of sort of saying that I do think that we're in a kind of a coarseness, peak at the moment, but these things tend to go up and down.
Up and down.
I'll dive in.
Yeah, please do.
So I want to pick up on this thread about it's not the end of the world. We have this resilience baked in. I want to be in agreement with that point, but that doesn't mean that we can sit back and just wait for it either. And so, just a little context here. Sabrina mentioned I'm the president of the Institute for Humane Studies, and it's an organization that is dedicated to advancing the principles of a free and open society, so principles of political and economic freedom, intellectual freedom, civic freedom. And First Amendment principles and the freedom of speech are chief among those principles, right? And so it goes without saying that I'm very much a champion of the the formal rules that underlie a constitutionally constrained liberal democracy, right? I say all that up front, though, because what I'm going to focus on in my comments here is not so much the formal rules of the game, but the informal norms, the values, the habits of mind, the habits of speech that shape our discourse as a free, self-governing people. And the kinds of norms I'm thinking of are things like a commitment to honesty, intellectual humility, curiosity, the practice and assumption of good faith. These are the kinds of things that I'm really dialing in on in today's moment. And I get that one reaction to that might be like a focus on how we speak to one another may feel in this particular moment like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? Sure. So I want to confront that skepticism head on, right? Because I think it's worth us kind of unpacking it a little bit. And what I would say is this, is that the formal rules of the game create the enabling conditions of ordered liberty, right? But from there, the rest of the work is on us, right? And so it's those informal norms that act as an essential complement to those formal rules of the game. Like take a different example, right? I'll come back to speech, but property rights, right? Clear, defensible property rights are essential for a functioning society. But most of the time, most of us are not going to the written word of property rights to guide our behavior. We're abstaining from violating other people's property rights because we've internalized the norm that says taking other people's stuff is wrong, right? That norm is doing tremendous heavy lifting, right? And so what you get is a kind of virtuous circle if everything's working out well. If you've got general rules that tap into people's instinct of fairness, and the generality there is really important because I'm not going to trust that other people are going to buy in if it's not a general principle, right? If it only benefits me, I'm not going to trust that it's going to work. It has to be general enough that everybody sees themselves as having a stake. When you get enough people, saying, I'm buying into this property rights regime, one of the things that happens there is good economic outcomes happen, good social outcomes happen. We find a way to settle disputes peacefully. We see expansion of the marketplace. We see an expansion of division of labor and growth and prosperity. And even if it's just sort of a kind of a fuzzy connection that we've got between our understanding of the rules, we're going to start to invest in the norms, right? Hey, good things happen when these rules are in place, but that means that we also have to be teaching our children. We have to be reinforcing those norms with each other and with our community members. That investment in the norms, then what does that do? It widens the circle of people who are buying into the principles. As the circle widens, the improvement happens even further, and that creates an incentive for us to invest further in the norms, which creates better outcomes, and that sort of like acceleration is what's happening. Yeah. So I think speech is the same thing in that we need these norms of forbearance, we need these norms of a kind of toleration for the First Amendment principles to stick. And if we do that, right, if we do that well, the outcome is that our conversations are better, but that's not just fluffy stuff. It means that we're much better equipped to see the humanity of every other person if we're taking as our first principle of how we speak to one another that there is an inherent dignity in that other person. That allows us to work with that person, that allows us to surface solutions to our complex challenges, but do it in a way that is hopefully liberty preserving, if not liberty enhancing, right? And it allows us to solve our problems together and allows us to really reach the promise of a liberal society and not just stick to its minimalist rules.
So I love that you brought up this idea of informal norms, because when I think about the early republic, I think anyone who's read about this period knows there was sort of this code of honor, and those were the norms that kept, sort of the founding fathers in check, right? So they were able to have all this debate, but the norms were the guardrails. And I'm wondering, is it that today we're simply missing those guardrails? And if so, if we want to have this new informal structure of norms, how do we populate that? How do we make that something that people understand and respect and work within, so that debate doesn't become something that we shy away from, but that we can embrace?
One thing I would just say about the norms, they shift. Yeah. And one of the flashpoints, to go back to the early republic, is when a norm shifts quickly. Mm-hmm. So after Aaron Burr kills Alexander Hamilton, dueling is significantly frowned upon. It is no longer seen as a way in which men are supposed to, sort of settle rebukes at their honor. Except Andrew Jackson thinks dueling is great, and lots of other people who are not from the well-heeled East Coast, who are more inland, think that dueling is fine. So when Jackson is running for president, he is portrayed by his opponents as a scoundrel because he is engaged in duels, even though from his perspective, I was adhering to the old norms. Right. And we see this today all the time. The waves of cancellations that happened in the last 10 years often involved, not always, but often involved behavior that was acceptable at one point or another. And in fact, one way to talk about the scoundrelness of Donald Trump is that he would have been like a member of the Rat Pack. The way he talks was normal and considered fine 50 years ago. Right. And so when we talk about that idea that kind of trying to preserve the norms and keeping the sort of guardrails up, we have to also understand is that these are shifting things. Mm-hmm. And here, I'd like to be even-handed, but one side, the left, the progressive side, wants to push, 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 always. And part of being a conservative in a kind of deep sense is to say, wait a second, sometimes the old ways are better.
And Emily, before you respond, I want to because I definitely actually want to get to this question of cancel culture, and we'll get to contemporary time in a minute, but, if we've always had these sort of inflections of sort of churlish political rhetoric, then why are we talking about it today? What is so bothersome about it that we're having an entire discussion because we feel like, well, even though it's always been here, what is it that's kind of getting at us?
Yeah. Well, the consequences are real. Right? Yeah. I think that's the important thing to recognize is that it's, one attitude is, we've had shifts in norms before, so let's not worry about it, right? But
I'm not saying don't worry about it.
Yeah, and I know that's not what you're...
I'm just saying that when a norm shifts too quickly, it's very often people on the other side of that are like, hey, wait a second, what's happened to my country? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then that gives them permission to then violate other norms.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying, is that there's a kind of like a little tug and a pull there.
Yeah. And so it's what are the permission structures that we're creating through our discourse? And so, when in Trump won, we had the sort of demonization, the dehumanizing rhetoric was on full display. The characterization of some people coming from shithole countries. You had, just to kind of recall some of the early statements about, all the immigrants were rapists and thieves. This kind of, and using language like vermin, and there was a reaction to that, and one counter reaction was, you guys are just being inflammatory. You guys are just, your hair is on fire from all of this stuff. Calm down. It's just words. But looking now at people being disappeared off the street, looking now at structures, hard structures that we can't seem to get innocent people back out of, right? So there is a connection between the rhetoric that's used, particularly by people with power, state power, and the outcomes that we're seeing today. So, I am very worried about offshore detention centers where we are seemingly setting ourselves up to send people that we don't want to have access to due process. That, to me, starts with the way in which we talk to or about other human beings.
Okay, can I just...
Yeah, please.
So I share your concern about where we've landed in terms of, I'd add to that a president that at times at least seems to be openly defying the Supreme Court, which is a constitutional crisis. Also, very Jacksonian, I might add.
Yeah. Parallels can.
However, I just want to go back to the asshole countries and stuff like that. Okay, I think that there's there's one story that you told, which is like, okay, there's the inflammatory rhetoric of the first term, and then there are these dangerous policies in the second term. But then there's another way to look at that, which is that the story actually starts much earlier, which is that there has always been a constituency in this country that has been worried about lots of unskilled labor coming in. That's been a legitimate political issue. And they would say they lost representation in our political discourse sometime in the 1990s. What they would say is that both parties became the pro-immigration party, both parties embraced globalization, both parties embraced policies, and this is not my position, it is the position, I think, though, of millions of Americans, that embraced policies that allowed for my community to basically be ruined by these larger economic forces which enriched coastal elites. That is their narrative. So when we use language like asshole countries and things like that, you're tone policing us, but we're trying to respond to a disaster that has been decades in the making. And we have not, and we've been, and there's a sense of sort of almost like the democracy part of the country wasn't working. Our voice wasn't heard. We were not represented, even by this so-called Republican Party that is supposed to be representing us. So that's where I think a lot of that's coming from. And if you want to know where that well of like often vitriol, hatred, whatever you want to call it, is coming from, and what Trump and his administration are channeling, it's that.
Yeah, and it's I think the diagnosis is wrong, as you're noting. It's like that's not the point of view. That immigrants have not diminished our country; they've enriched our country. But your point about being dismissed and being set aside, the deplorables comment, right, from Hillary Clinton, is a really important case in point, where the people that she was asking to vote for her, she was calling them deplorable because of their points of view, because of their concerns. And that's a dramatic mistake. It created a permission structure on the other side to double down.
I would go one further. I would say that there was a similar kind of example. In the 20-teens, it was quite normal for leading journalists, political analysts, PhDs who studied this to say, the browning of America, the country is becoming less white, and that will benefit the Democratic Party. When Tucker Carlson started saying that and called it the replacement theory, there was a chorus of people that compared him to David Duke. Now, when something like that happens, because substantively that is the same analysis pretty much, and I'm no fan of Tucker Carlson, especially now. My point, though, is that when something like that happens, that has an incredibly corrosive effect to norms, because what it says is, these aren't norms, this is a rigged game. Why should I bother following norms when it will always be used against me and my interests? And that's a big part of the story. So I agree with you. It is a 5-alarm fire when a president is ignoring the Supreme Court and not facilitating the return of somebody from a Salvadoran jail. All of that absolutely freaks me out, and I'm against it. But I'm just saying the big part of that story, though, is that the norms themselves were so inconsistently
applied.
Yeah,
fair point.
So I know we could talk about norms probably for the entire panel, but I do want to shift just a little bit from creating, from the guardrails that we need to what happens when we actually try to quell free speech. And again, in our 250 years, we have plenty of examples of this. Obviously, in the last 10 years, we saw the rise of cancel culture really sort of took hold around Me Too, and then further in 2019, 2020. But it's really just sort of a reiteration of something that we've seen so many times. American history, I think back all the way to the Alien and Sedition Acts, to the gag rules of the 19th century, the suspension of habeas corpus. So I guess I'm curious, is the efforts to suppress free speech actually, does it go in these same cycles as our sort of these upticks in political rhetoric? Do they happen simultaneously, or sort of is it a pattern that we're seeing that will sort of also fade in another couple of years?
Sounds like a history question.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, efforts to suppress speech in our country have been a failure for the censors. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a history of American free speech, which is like sort of shows that every so-called victory for moralists or people who are trying to punish speech has been a Pyrrhic victory, because for lots of different reasons they usually end up losing. Yeah. The best example of this is the obscenity trials of Lenny Bruce, which is what I am working on right now for my next episode of Breaking History. But I mean, you could argue that the prosecutors in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago had a bit of success, and they also certainly had a success of helping to drive Lenny Bruce sort of to the point where he took his own life through a drug overdose. But right after his death, the country kind of exploded in obscenity, and the moralists who were trying to ban dirty words and pornography and things like that have just been on a 60, 70-year losing streak. And the country and the culture is, so what it shows is that the culture is so much more powerful in this case than the law. There are other pernicious threats to speech, though, that don't involve, prosecutors, hauling off comedians and nightclub owners before grand juries. There is, I would argue, the kind of overreaction to disinformation that we saw in social media, which ended up suppressing or filtering out lots of very legitimate points, whether it was the COVID lab leak theory or Hunter Biden's laptop, or on and on and on. And that is that. But then again, I'm not saying this was by design, but how's that working out, guys? Like, how's the disinformation space working out now? Elon Musk bought Twitter. And what's kind of even more amazing is that Facebook and all these other companies kind of basically followed suit. Same thing, sort of tangential relating to DEI, happened as well. I mean, it's like, so these things are, when you try to impose these limits in a heavy-handed manner by seriously punishing people or taking away their platform, it might work for a little bit, but usually it's going to blow up in your face. You will be hoisted on your own petard.
Just as coming out of a higher ed adjacent space, we can't let this conversation pass without talking about sort of what was the moment, or at least a recent moment, where things seemed to shift. And I would name it a little bit earlier than you did, Sabrina, in the fall semester of 2015, because that's where, at least in my mind, I was a provost at the time, just really kind of minding my business of higher education. And I remember just being completely and utterly shocked at the viral imagery of a journalism professor calling for muscle to remove a student journalist. What are you thinking? What are you thinking? But that "what are you thinking" question is a really good question. What are you thinking? Like, what made you think that that was the appropriate norm to emphasize? As a journalism professor, you had absolutely, no business doing that. But even, as an academic at all, as a person living in a free society at all. But what was shocking to me was how open and transparent that call for physical force was, and the kind of conjoining of that call for physical force with a moral kind of imperative, right? Like, and I'm on the right side of history in making this request, and so to me that was a turning point in higher ed. We also saw the way to when faculty would learn about a scholar coming on to campus who is going to be advanced, who may advance some controversial points of view, rather than preparing students to say, hey, y'all, let's show up, let's learn the arguments that this person's making, and let's have our best counter arguments ready to go. Instead, it was much more of a, I'm thinking, of course, of the famous 2017 of Middlebury.
Yep, my alma mater.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't break your heart.
Absolutely.
So what the preparation and the thought that went into that moment was, all I could see was wasted effort and counterproductive effort. Like, there could have been a teachable moment there, a learning moment, but it didn't, right? And then and then you move on to the much more recent post October 7th moment, and the heads of some of our most prestigious institutions of higher learning are hauled off before Congress. Now, I didn't appreciate the Inquisition-style questioning, interrogation coming from the bench, but what broke my heart, it was not the fact that they just had a bad tone about, sort of a tone deaf to the concerns about anti-Semitism. They leaned on First Amendment principles. They leaned on principles of academic freedom, and they had no credibility to do so. That was the thing.
Right on.
That was the thing. I actually liked their arguments.
Yeah, I agree, but they were not credible making them.
But they weren't credible making them. And that, to me, was an arc that went from 2015 to 2023. That's a pretty quick dissolution.
Well, and I think you're picking up on something that I've been trying to make sense of, especially in thinking about this conversation, which is that so many of these themes seem to be connected, right? We're seeing this rapidly diminished trust in institutions, and I would say universities are one of those major institutions. Lack of trust in our media, right? Lack of trust in our different parts of our government. We're also seeing, Erica Schoder, our executive director, just had a conversation with Lenore Skenazy about raising children to be, good citizens, right? People don't know how to navigate complicated, uncertain times. And all of these things seem to be fitting together with, maybe it's the lack of trust and the uncertainty together has led to an increased coarseness in how we talk to one another and how we navigate these debates. Do you think that's taking it too far, or is there sort of a connectiveness between all of this? I don't know.
Thoughts? I'll jump
Well,
in.
I think when you go into a situation thinking that it's, the end is near, if you engage in a kind of, if you believe that, like, our way of life is under threat, or, Trump is Hitler and he's a fascist and he's going to take away our liberty, then that is the permission structure to then go down this road of various kinds of norm violations. So when you're talking about losing trust in institutions, it's always a two-way street. So, I try to always steel man and put myself in the thing. I mean, I have great contempt for the professors and students who, in my view, have protested in solidarity with Hamas. However, from their perspective, if they believe the words they say, they think that Israel's committing a genocide. If you think that you're stopping a genocide, why are we even having a conversation about allowing the other side to speak, or manners, or politeness? If you believe that there is a concerted plan from the Davoisie to the Mono Party to ruin America by allowing a bunch of illegal immigrants that were going to take everybody's jobs, why are you lecturing me about my tone? Why are you? This is an emergency.
Right.
So I'm saying that both sides do that, and that's how you lose the institutions.
Right.
Because we don't have time right now. It's a crisis. Sometimes there really are crises.
Yeah.
Like in the Warsaw Ghetto, you shouldn't have a discussion about Robert's Rules of Order. You just but most times it's not that.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah. And I want to pull the lens back a little bit to where you started. You talked about an honor culture.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not a fan of bringing back the duel, except in my fantasy life where I'm a Hollywood producer, and I would like if we did bring back the duel, that might be a really really
sometimes
fun
in
concept.
traffic here in DC.
Yeah, I might pitch that to Netflix. But the loss of an honor culture it has some real downsides, right? I mean, I'm, again, not wanting to bring back the duel, but the First Amendment, as important and as essential as it is, it doesn't solve some pretty deep moral, ethical challenges we have related to speech. And one of the sort of like pivot points in recent conversations about free speech is self-censorship. And what do we do with self-censorship? And it's one of the things that really bugs me about all the surveys on self-censorship is they're all framed in such a way that any self-report that says, yeah, I feel I self-censored in that moment is always seen as a bad thing. I think this is probably a pretty controversial thing to say in this room, but that's not always the case, right?
Self-censorship is good.
You know, sometimes you know, it's a form of self-governance, right? Yes. If your reasoning for self-censoring is, you know, Sabrina has just said something that I need to take some time and rethink my own position, right. And I want to take some time to do that. Like, that is a perfectly reasonable way to reason why you would self-censor.
In fact, we teach that to our children, right?
Right. If Eli's being a jerk, and I want to, you know, come back with full force, you know, like, if I know that what's going to come out is not reason, but anger, then me engaging in some self-censorship there is a form of discipline, right? It's not cowardice, it's not conformity. But here's the thing, knowing which is which, you know, am I being complicit with, you know, this sort of regime of of shutting down speech and dampening down truth? Or am I, you know, like, do I need to have that courage in this moment? That all has to happen in real time when your heart's pounding out of your chest. And you've got to solve two problems. One, the sorting problem. Is this the moment when it's legitimate or important for me to kind of hold my tongue? Or is this the moment when I need to summon that courage and speak the truth, even though there's going to be negative consequences? And I've got to do that in a split second, again, with my heart pounding out of my chest. That's really hard, and that's why reps matter. That's why institutions of higher learning, all learning spaces, whether it's your own dinner table or in a classroom, you need reps to work through that feeling of, I don't know what to do in this moment. It's exactly
practice.
Practice.
And that's what,
the game of sport is exactly the same way.
And I will just say that our founders did practice, right? I mean, they had debate societies to practice for public life. We do not do that.
And I just add a brilliant point, by the way.
Yeah.
One other factor to consider, and that is incentives. So I go back to, at the height of the sort of narrowness of mainstream media, 1968, there's a famous series of debates on CBS between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley. And in one of these, and they are great debates, I highly recommend it, there's a great documentary on this. In one of these debates, Gore Vidal calls Buckley a crypto-fascist, and Buckley famously calls him a queer and says, I'll slap you and leave you permanently plastered or something. Now, Buckley regretted that intemperate outburst, that sort of made you say lack of self-regulation, if you will, for the rest of his life. He thought that Gore had baited him, and that he took the bait, and that was it. If that had happened today, they would give them a $2 million streaming deal. They'd say more of that, and they would call it the crypto-fascist queer debates, because that's what, at least in terms of public intellectual life, that kind of those moments where for before in the old times, you would sort of consider kind of a low point, a point of embarrassment. That can make your career. Yeah. And you look at the people who are thriving in Congress today, they're the people who would lean into that moment. Yeah. So I just say the incentive structures right now in some ways are against that self-regulation.
I'm going to transition us one more time because I want to get a couple more contemporary sort of ideas in place. You know, R Street stands for free markets, limited effective government. And so sometimes when I see the political fighting, I have to say I'm not necessarily opposed to it because from my perch, I think this is helping slow the government growth. This is helping slow sort of like something being rammed through Congress, right? When we have that back and forth, it actually can be a good thing. And so is there a way of thinking about political sort of vitriol in a positive light, especially for the free marketers in the room? Maybe if you're not a free marketer in the room, you'll have a different perspective. But
no, I love the marketplace of ideas metaphor. Yeah. I mean, I don't just like it. I love the marketplace of ideas metaphor right. because the exchange of ideas is like a market. Mm-hmm. But some people will hear that phrase and say, oh, it's all transactional. Right? No, because when I look out in the world and I see markets, I see thriving, I see people engaging in peaceful, cooperative behavior, deeply social behavior, and that so much of our, so many of our friendships and human connections happens in our commercial lives, in our lives at work, et cetera. So, I see the marketplace as a very rich social space. And from the same standpoint, the marketplace of ideas, it's not combat. It's a contest, yeah. But it's not combat. And the difference between war and peaceful exchange of whether it's goods and services or ideas, that's a dramatically different thing than warfare. Mm-hmm. Warfare is destructive on all sides. And so if we look at what's happening in the halls of Congress, right? I'm with you that sometimes gridlock is definitely underrated, right?
Yeah, right.
But when there is gridlock that people bemoan, it's because there's a truly contestable space, right? Where the idea, the policy is getting contested, and that's why it's not moving through, because it's meeting with appropriate and functional friction. Mm-hmm. But that's a very different thing than a kind of warlike scenario where ideas are outside of that space. We're not creating, if what characterizes our discourse is affective polarization where we hate each other first before mm-hmm. anything, before everything, right? Well, then the ideas won't get debated. The goodness that comes from the friction doesn't transpire. It's just because we've tipped from a contestable space to a warfare space, and that is destructive of our humanity. It's destructive of all the good things that can come from human cooperation.
And there's no consensus building that comes
Correct.
Out of that, right?
Yeah.
Eli, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. That was a great answer.
Okay. Do you have anything you want to say? I just wanted to make sure that we don't always frame these kind of debates as negative, because
I think there's another side of it. I mean, sometimes you could say that, it just seems so obvious. There's a consensus right now for, immigration reform has been one of these things where at least both parties in their rhetoric have kind of said they generally wanted to do these things in a certain way and that never got done. Mm-hmm. I think another part of this that we have to talk about is that Congress has, which is a scenario, by the way, I don't think the founders ever contemplated, which is that one branch of government would self-neuter itself. And not assert its prerogatives, its constitutional prerogatives, which is kind of amazing, but that's the era we've lived through. So we have a really superpowered executive right now. So maybe one explanation you could argue for gridlock is that it matters a whole lot less than it did 70 years ago. I mean, that's why, even though I'm sometimes derided as a war hawk, or somebody who's an interventionist, I actually would love to see Congress claw back its war-making authorities, because I just think Congress needs to assert more of its authorities.
To create a parallel to an earlier point you made, Eli, that didn't start with Trump.
No, it didn't.
The sort of moving away from the responsibilities of the first branch of government, that happened long before
Trump. Trump is not always the cause; he's often the symptom.
Right, decades of it. And at lunch, we're going to be talking about also the lack of power in political parties today. And it's interesting because when we think about historically, one of the reasons for that code of honor was because we didn't really have strong political parties. Now, again, we don't really have strong political parties, and things are coming to fill that void. This summit is called the Real Solutions Summit, and something that we're really trying to lean into with all of our conversations today is sort of what's next, what can be done, how do we make things better. I think this has been really revealing to me. There's just as with everything, so many different sides to a story and so many different nuances to consider. But Eli, I'll start with you. You're at the Free Press. Obviously, this is a departure from traditional media. Are you part of the solution?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm...
Yeah. This is your moment. Come on.
I think the Free Press is a really special place, and it's an honor to work there with your brother and Barry and so many other great colleagues, and I hope everybody subscribes. And one of the things we try to do is when we are faced with a contentious issue, for example, I felt very strongly that the legal grounds and at least the initial position to deny Mahmoud Khalil, the first Colombia permanent resident who they were trying to deport, any kind of due process, and what appeared to be on just first, like what I thought was basically deporting him for his speech. I was very much against that, even though I despised the speech that Khalil had, and I was able to write in something we call the Fight Club, and then there was somebody who took the other side. So what we try to do is actually present readers with uncomfortable positions and not just, sort of retreat to your, tribe. And we don't want to just be, one of another, outlet that is only going to kind of give you one thing. We want to try to have a pretty broad view, and we don't want to, and we want to offer a lot of different perspectives. Maybe that'll work. I think it'll work. I hope it works. But that's one of the things that we're trying to do, that I think that there were a lot of views that at least maybe we're starting to see a change, but like in the mainstream media, they just sort of said, this is beyond the pale, it's totally toxic. Right. And, we can't platform. I hate that phrasing of platforming. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s and you watch like the Dick Cavett show, he would have on total racists like Lester Maddox in dialogue and debate with Muhammad Ali. Yeah. That's a good thing, by the way, even though, one of those people is on the wrong side of history. So, that is something I think the Free Press is very good at, and I think that we are also covering Trump. There's such a temptation to just pick a side. Yeah. Join your tribe. And then so what we're trying to do is just to demonstrate, to model a way that you can be a journalistic and media outlet that doesn't demonize the guy all the time and always take the bait, but isn't going to just be kind of marching down and saying everything he's doing is wonderful. So we've had plenty of very critical stuff on him, and we've had some, I think, really interesting and thoughtful defenses of things that made me think as somebody who, is on staff there. So I hope that the Free Press is part of it. So that's my little spiel there. And
before, Emily, I have you jump in, do you think there is room? I mean, I do. I do think there's room for more outlets that are not the same as the Free Press, but that sort of help us restore trust in sort of credible news outlets so that we have more places to get information from. And I hope that some of these new, and we're going to have Jonah Goldberg here later at the Dispatch, I mean, I think these are shifts that we'll look back on and say, hey, I think we were seeing a turning point. What are your thoughts? Where especially culturally and at the Academy, what can we do?
Thinking through the Academy, but also just parenting.
Yes.
We've got a lot.
We've got a lot of parenting notes today.
Right. Yeah. We've got a lot of organizational leaders. The culture, culture for engagement, conversational engagement in your various organizations. We all have important levers we can be pulling. So that sense of agency that Eli is describing, that the Free Press exercises, we can be doing that in all sorts, in myriad ways. But getting a little bit off the high horse and asking your local Little League coach to help you help others, right? Because what's the metaphor here? A Little League coach is really good at drilling so that there's this muscle memory built up. And if you don't like sports, maybe it's the ballet teacher, right? Before the performance, there are 1,000 rehearsals. Why? Because you want to build up that habit such that you don't need to do the cognitive thinking through in a hard way through most of the performance or in the game, because it's just natural. You have a natural default to exercising humility, curiosity, recognizing that even if your first reaction is that person's got it all wrong, but saying, but instead of saying, that person's got it all wrong and I must crush them, that person's got it all wrong. And I'm so curious about how this really smart person, sincere and smart person, got it so wrong. Okay,
Right.
let me hear more, right? And even that posture, to see it as excitement and fun and a joy to engage with someone that you don't understand and you don't know why they hold those views, just shifting it ever so slightly to that default that delights in the exchange, that can happen, but we can't just say it in principle. We actually have to create the environments where it gets practiced all the time.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean about the Little League coach. So whether you're a college professor, a college administrator, somebody who leads a team in your organization, or an organizational leader, we all have those levers that we can pull to create environments where we're cultivating those default responses, that muscle memory.
I love that. And I guess if I had to offer a real solution today, it would be to have family dinner every night, because that is where we have these conversations with our kids. And so many of the things that we've talked about in terms of identifying credible outlets and information and listening and practicing how you approach an issue, that's what happens when you're in a comfortable place at home and you can have that practice, because I don't see us bringing back the Cliosophic societies and the rest of them. So not right now, at least. Well, let me thank you.
Can I make one more
Oh,
suggestion
yes, we have,
on
I
this?
think, one last minute.
In one last minute, the great courses.
Yes.
I think
That's
that
great.
this is an idea I'm kind of stealing from John McWhorter, who talked about it in a recent sort of event with Glenn Lowry. But it is true that today, younger people, because of their phones, and all of us maybe because of our phones, we're not as good at reading and focusing for like a long time. I'm certainly, I try to read a lot, but I read, I think, in little bursts as opposed to the way I used to. One way around that, especially, is just like there's so many terrific courses that are available pretty much for free or on Audible, where you can like listen for 40 minutes a day and just refamiliarize yourself with the original arguments of Aristotle or Plato, and you can go through the list, or the Federalist Papers, or whoever. And I just think that that is one way back, is to just figure out a way to sort of package the old great books in a new medium where people can get them. And I just think that that also will help.
I love that.
And that spirit comes through in your podcast.
Yes,
you
it
very
does.
much.
And it's interesting. There's so much out there. When I was looking for a quote the other day, and I couldn't find a book, on the shelf. And of course, I stumbled upon this podcast that is literally the letters between Adams and Jefferson. There's
that's
so
great.
many, and I haven't listened to it.
love
I hadn't heard it before. So
McCullough writes in his McCullough did a lot on that in his Adams biography, but I love those.
That's why, and I couldn't find the quote, and I thought I was searching
especially
for
given
it.
the 1800 election where they were just bitter rivals.
So ugly. So, well, with that, I really want to thank Eli Lake, Emily Chamlee-Wright. Thank you both so much. This has been so interesting, and I feel like it really helped us set the stage for the rest of the day. We are not taking an official break now, because the next panel is just, I feel like, a natural progression from this conversation. So you're going to want to stay put. R Street's board member Katie Harbath is going to be moderating Rethinking the Rules Governing AI in Online Spaces. So more about the information landscape and how we engage with one another coming up now. So thank you. Thank you.